Welcome to this conversation with my friend Jim Stewart. James, welcome to the Ford Foundation.
Well, thank you, Darren. What a beautiful setting. Thank you all for coming on this unbelievably hot day.
Well,
Maybe it's to get cool. I don't know.
you and I knew that we needed to be in our summer wear. So
Yes.
thank you for dressing down for the Ford Foundation in the summer, because that's what we do here. Now, you, Jim, have written this book. And I have to say, you and Rachel Abrams, both of you, Pulitzer Prize winning journalists. You, of course, wrote Den of Thieves, among others. Your Pulitzer for coverage of insider trading and what happens on Wall Street over your career is pretty unparalleled. But I have to say, unscripted. The epic battle for a media empire and the Redstone family legacy. This book, it is a beautiful, almost lyrical storytelling of one of the iconic media empires in American history, Paramount, CBS, and its subsidiaries. So it's Wall Street Journal meets New York Times business section meets Dynasty meets Dallas meets Lifestyle of the Rich and Famous, Knots Landing, and so many other epic television shows.
Many of which were on CBS.
Of course they were. But I have to say, I truly could not believe that it was possible that this literally happened, and that Sumner Redstone's life, Shari Redstone, his daughter, and the various and sundry people who were in their lives, in his life especially.
And their pockets.
Yes, we will get to, well, they were in his pockets and in other parts of his clothes. And as you document here, this book is also, it is about greed and vanity and mendacity and narcissism, but it's also about, there's misogyny and just a shocking way in which women, and particularly Shari Redstone, who was seen by many as a villain, certainly some of the directors of Paramount. So let's talk about, first of all, can you believe that you wrote this book with this stuff? I mean,
Well, you'd think after all the decades I've been a reporter that like I've seen it all, or every once in a while I sort of think I've seen it all. And then I run into this stuff. Rachel, my co-author, there's a character there named George Pilgrim, who, to say he's colorful is putting it mildly.
oh my gosh.
And she had gone out, he lives in Sedona, Arizona, and she had gone out there over Memorial Day weekend to talk to him. And he was a writer's dream because he saved everything, every email, every text, every photograph. He could document virtually everything he had to say, which is pretty good because otherwise what he said was unbelievable. And Rachel would call me, not just every day, but like every hour or two when she'd get away from George for a few minutes, she'd say, oh my God, he just told me this, and he told me that, and he just gave me this. And we were gasping. And some of it we were saying, oh, this cannot be true. So I said, Rachel, we have to get other sources. We can't rely on him. He was a con man, he was in jail.
But he did have like emails and
Yes,
documentation.
so we had all these documents, and then also he had the names of other people who he contemporaneously had told this. So at one point he escapes from rehab. Needless to say, he had drug and drinking problems, and he was in the rehab. They'd taken away his wallet, and they even took away his cell phone. And he escaped from rehab and claimed that he talked a cab driver into taking him 1,000 miles back to Sedona with the promise that when he got there, he said, I have $5,000 in a safe and I'm going to give you the money when I get there. And according to him, the guy accepted that. Well, we said that, this is not real life. He shows up, he has no wallet, he has no phone, he has no ID, he has no driver's license, and he says, drive me to Sedona, Arizona, and I'll pay you $5,000. Well, we tracked down the driver,
He,
and it was true.
yes.
And I will say, George is a very charming person.
Well, very handsome man.
Very handsome and charming.
very charming. And yes, it is easy to understand. Well, it's not easy to understand how he could get someone to do that. But tell us about Shari Redstone.
Yeah, so Sherry's the daughter of Sumner Redstone, the patriarch of this, the guy, the architect of the empire, turned himself into a multi-billionaire, brilliant student first at Harvard and then Harvard Law School, which, by the way, I thought a very revealing personality trait was he obsessed over the fact that he had gotten all A's at Harvard Law School, but he got a D
Yes.
in constitutional law. And when Harvard came around to ask him for money, he's now a multi-billionaire. That's all he wanted to talk
Yes,
about.
you say here that that poor Martha Minow.
Martha Minow
was
got
harassed.
subjected to this. Anyway, so he
And
put
of
this
course,
together.
Jim was a Harvard Law School graduate too,
That's
of
true.
course. So,
I did
but
not-
you did not get
I
any
did not
D's
get
because
any
you were on the law
Ds.
review. But that's another whole story. Go ahead.
Anyway, so Sherry's his daughter. He totally alienated his son, who had, fled and disappeared into Colorado, never to be heard from again. And Sherry, he would alternately, if you've seen Succession, this will sound familiar to you, he would alternately raise her up on a pedestal, praise her, and then knock the pedestal out from under her and criticize her, withhold his affection and love. So she had a very difficult life under him. But she was the heir, or she was trying to, save the family empire and the fortune and, her father, tend to her father's well-being. But there were all these boards of directors and cronies of his who uniformly dismissed her, who belittled her, partly because he did. But I think they just saw, she was an accident of birth, she wouldn't be here. She did go to law school herself. But she's just, because she's the daughter, she is here, we have to put up with her, but we don't have any respect for her, and we're not going to pay attention to her. And it became really hostile, as you see in these pages. So there were all of these, terrible things said about her. She was trying to sabotage this deal. She tried to undermine hiring someone here. I mean, in sabotaging a deal, at one point there was a plan by Sumner's so-called surrogate son who ran the Viacom Paramount
Yes.
empire, Philippe Domont.
Philippe, yes.
And he wanted to sell the Paramount studio, which was the crown jewel of Sumner's empire, to some Chinese company. And then the board were all going around saying that Sherry was trying to destroy it, was undermining that deal. And of course, not only was that very damaging to her, but it was of interest to me because for her, the daughter and a controlling shareholder of the company, to try to sabotage a deal that was going to sell it for $10 billion, which was a huge price tag, was not in the interest of shareholders. That was a violation, a clear violation of her fiduciary duty to shareholders, and could have landed her, if not in jail, certainly in trouble with the SEC. So that's a very serious allegation. It would have been quite a bombshell if I could prove that. So I actually tracked down the actual investment bankers who were working on that deal, which was not easy. You're dealing with a Chinese company.
Your research is amazing.
Secretive investment bankers anyway, but I finally did get to the bottom of that, and Sherry had nothing to do with that deal falling apart. There never was a deal. She
But
never
this is
talked to
consistent
them.
with how you document the ways in which she was consistently, things were attributed to her
Yes.
that were false.
Another good example, the downfall of Les Moonves at CBS was at least appeared to be triggered by the New Yorker story by Ronan Farrow, which revealed he did 2 articles, a total of 12 women who accused him of, to put it mildly, inappropriate behavior. And the rumors then immediately went out, Sherry and her detectives had gathered all this information and then just simply handed it to Ronan, making it very easy for him to do this, and in her campaign to destroy Les Moonves. Now, even if that were true, it doesn't change the fact that these women were saying this, but nevertheless, again, it was imputing to her the evil motive of trying to destroy Moonves. And by the way, it also belittles the work that Ronan Farrow did. So between Rachel and me, we tracked down, all 12, not all of them would talk, but we talked to many of those women, and we independently traced how it was that they got to Ronan, and we also spoke to Ronan. And Sherry had nothing to do whatsoever with that.
Well, when
then-
you harass 12 women, it doesn't take another woman to tell.
No. And then
reporter that.
even more tellingly, there's a confidential source who provided us with a treasure trove of material. And in the book, we could not identify the confidential source. But the confidential source has now gone public.
Yes.
It's come forward, and she was interviewed by Rachel. And if you want to look it up in the New York Times website, there's a really, to me, fascinating podcast. The Daily did a whole episode with her, and she explains why she did this. And I'm so glad she did, because, again, everyone, when the book came out, everyone said, oh, Sherry is the one who leaked all that information to you. Sherry was privy to these confidential things because CBS had them, and she's the controlling shareholder. And I can now tell you and prove it that Sherry had nothing to do with leaking any of those confidential materials. Nothing whatsoever. So over and over again, I cannot tell you how many hours of reporting time I spent tracking down these allegations against her, none of which turned out to be true, which then, of course, begs the question, so why were people spreading these? You know, these are, and the people who were, these are board members of prominent corporations who are going around telling reporters false, scurrilous things about the controlling shareholder. I think it's fair to say if she were the Sun, that would not have happened.
So before we get to Les Moonves and the board, there are just a few things that just stick out for me here. So Sumner Redstone is on his private plane, and there is a flight attendant
Yes.
who he does not know.
That's never seen before.
He has never seen before, and she approaches him as a flight attendant does, and he says, I hear women like to be spanked. Do you like to be spanked?
By the way,
But he's like old as Methuselah. I mean, like, how old was Sumner Redstone when he was saying this to?
I don't know, 90.
He was 90 years old, and he is saying to this young, like, I hear women like to be spanked.
And by the way, she is very attractive, a willowly blonde. She came from a large conservative Mormon family from Salt Lake City, and he says this to her on the plane.
And it's her first day on the job.
It's her first
and
day on the
like she
job.
literally. Okay, and so let's just.
And by the way, they weren't alone on the plane.
Yes.
A CBS director and a very prominent Hollywood producer and his wife are sitting there while this exchange is going on.
So there are a few people you need to tell the audience about who feature prominently. You talked about George Pilgrim. Who are Sidney Holland and Manuela Herzog?
Well, it would take me a long time to truly answer that. But in a nutshell, Sumner, again, he's 90 years old. He comes to Hollywood. We discovered that his mother would not let him date in high school. And then whenever he brought a girl home, she was never good enough. The mother always was extremely critical. Now, I'm not a psychiatrist, but read into that what you want. But Sumner, believe me, at the age of 90, coming to Hollywood, made up for lost time. And he was dating all of these women, he's lavishing millions of dollars on them. But Sidney Holland finally got her tentacles into him. They were set up by, again, you could make this up, but his grandson actually called the millionaire matchmaker.
Yes, I saw this.
Of reality TV fame.
Yes.
And said, you've got to help me, he's driving me crazy. Because Sumner was plucking Brandon's girlfriend.
His girlfriends, exactly.
They would go out, the three of them would go out together, and then Sumner would leave with the girlfriend.
Yes,
and then
you are 30 and you're on a date and you bring your grandfather and you go to the bathroom and he's gone with your
left
date.
in the limo with the date. And then and a month later, the girlfriend has gotten like a $2 million house in Beverly Hills. So Brandon couldn't compete. Anyway, Brandon said, he's driving me crazy. I can't deal with this. You've got to save me here. Although why he would go to a reality TV star, I don't know. But anyway, he did. So she's the one who set Sumner up with Sidney. And they started dating. And she wasn't Sumner's first choice, but he circled back around, and soon they were like fast friends, shall we say.
Yes.
And she got an engagement ring.
You got a bunch of stuff.
She got is it 8 or 9 carats? It's huge.
Yeah.
She got this massive diamond ring, but interestingly, never actually wanted to get married. It was.
Well, he was buying her a lot of stuff.
Yeah, and by the way, if you actually get married, the lawyers then circle around and do a prenuptial agreement. But if you keep this endless engagement going on, you're not bound by some kind of contract. So she set about, I think, slowly but surely separating him from elements of his fortune. And then at some point, his ex-girlfriend was this Manuela Herzer, who was introduced to him at a dinner hosted by Robert Evans, the Hollywood producer, who was also notorious for womanizing. And I mean, the things that went on in the Evans mansion, again, could be a book in themselves. But by the way, now owned by David Zaslav of Warner Brothers. That's an aside. So Manuela was having her house remodeled and asked Sumner if she could just temporarily move in also to the mansion where Sidney was already living. And he said yes.
So his old girlfriend and his new girlfriend
Yes.
are both living with
Are
him.
both living with him in the mansion. And 2 years later, Manuel is still there. As far as I know, that house is still being renovated. I mean, it never got, and he's paying for a lot of the renovations. Anyway, so they moved in, and then a great part of the drama is the way they slowly but surely, I mean, they were sued later for elder abuse, and I think if that had ever really been litigated, they would have lost. It had all the hallmarks, classic elder abuse, and separating him from his family, keeping Sherry locked out of the house. They went to war. And if it were not for the fact that Sidney, for reasons that, you know, again, I know he's handsome and charming, but Sidney started having an affair with George. And that was the one thing that Sumner would not tolerate. And the fact that that blew up, that's a part of the big story. But, you know, what's amazing about it is when they had their first date at the pool of the Peninsula Hotel in Beverly Hills, naturally, it would be a super visible, you know, celebrity-studded location. She knew that he was he'd served time. I mean, this wasn't a mystery. Now, what was a mystery is that he had also come to Hollywood and impersonated the grandson of William Randolph Hearst. He went around saying he was George Hearst. And but nobody knew this. This is a revelation in this book.
Yes,
it's
there are many
incredible to me.
revelations.
This is an only in America story. So he went around impersonating George Hearst. Now, if anyone had looked at the years that George Hearst lived, you would realize that someone of George's age could not be his grandson. He would have had to conceive, you know, in his infancy or something. But nevertheless, he went around. He was friends with Michael Bay and all these Hollywood celebrities, and he was driving around in a black Porsche. And then, as only somebody like George would do, he agreed to make a reality TV movie about his life. It was called Filthy Rich, I think, or something endless, something rich, with this this woman named Louise Hay, a beautiful blonde actress who was his girlfriend. So they made a whole reality movie. Now, George later told me, he said, well, I never thought that it was really going to ever get aired. But then one day he's driving down Sunset Boulevard, and there's a giant billboard with his picture on it saying, the true story of William Randolph Hearst. And he said, uh-oh. And that's what blew it up, because the Hearst family then found out.
Of course.
And, you know.
They kind of are in media, too.
They sued him. But the thing went on cable TV, and it was then removed as part of the settlement. However, George had kept a copy, and he gave it to Rachel. So Rachel and I watched this movie, which is really, when you know the real story, it's just so, the idea that it's a reality show is such a joke. Nothing about it is real. But Louise Hay, the girlfriend, according to George, she wanted to marry him, and he didn't, and he pushed her off. That she wanted to get married to get a green card because she was from Scotland. Well, she did get married. Guess who she married? Stephen Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary under
It never
Trump.
stops. This book, I'm telling you, it's just never.
Could I make that up? That's all in the first two pages.
I know. This is what I'm saying. Okay, so as I said, this book is, you just won't even believe this is from a Pulitzer Prize-winning business reporter. Okay, so let's get to the business part of this.
Yes.
Paramount.
But let me just say, you can't separate business from psychology. But let's go on here.
But again, this is an epic battle for an iconic American media empire.
Yeah, we're talking many billions of dollars, not to mention cultural influence.
And so talk about Les Moonves, Philippe, I mean, all of the players, because many of us know, if you go back and look in the index, we know lots of people in the index because they were directors of Paramount and CBS. They were people in Hollywood. They were people in New York in entertainment. Why did this epic battle happen in the first place?
Well, Sumner created the empire, and he divided it into two companies. One was CBS, and one was Viacom, and Viacom included the Paramount studio. And Les Moonves had been running CBS very successfully. Whatever else you want to say about Les Moonves, he was known as the man with the golden gut. He picked hit shows, and he took CBS from the last place network to the number 1 network for like 12 years in a row, where it remains to this day. It was an amazing achievement. And then he put Philippe Dumont ahead of Paramount/Viacom, which included MTV, Comedy Central, Nickelodeon, all those cable channels. He had been his lawyer. They were very close. And one of the succession-like aspects of this, although Succession never really did this, he called Philippe Dumont his surrogate son. His real son was banished, but meanwhile he could pit Dumont against Sherry. So they were like at loggerheads. I mean, Sherry hated it that he was going around saying, "Oh, like Philippe is my surrogate son," naturally. So the battle really started on a number of fronts. Obviously, Sumner is in his 90s. He's getting older. It's at some point they had to at the shareholder meetings they had to wheel him in or
there's a publicly
carry
traded
him in. Yes, this
company,
is
so
publicly
shareholders are-
traded. The votes were controlled by the Redstone family.
Right, but
And Sumner and his trustees, who he handpicked. So he essentially controlled all of that. But then his mental state began to deteriorate. And one of the things we were able to get, many people were mystified by this, but we were able to get the actual psychiatric records of his evaluation, and they're quite sad to read. Although, I think in many of these situations, people say, well, you're either competent or you're not competent. But it's more complicated than that. He was competent in some ways, and then he wasn't competent in others, but clearly he wasn't the man he once was, mentally or physically. And then he had the two women separating from it, and they mounted their own campaign to gain control of the companies. And it's astonishing to me, one of the revelations of the book is how close they came. Using the lawyers who were supposedly representing Sumner, the lawyers have a lot to answer for, and speaking as a lawyer, they have a lot to answer for in this book. That Sumner's paying the bills, but who were they really helping along? Who really controlled who the lawyers were? The two women. The women were the ones who recommended that he hire this lawyer. So the lawyer knew that her bread was being buttered, to the tune of many, many millions of dollars, by the women. So they pretty much were getting what they wanted. And then people said, oh, no, there was an irrevocable trust so that Sherry and the family would always control that. But all it would have taken was for Sumner, who controlled the trustees, to, for example, sell CBS to the two women for some nominal amount. And that's what they were working up when the affair with George blew up. They were on the brink of gaining control. In fact, I sort of say, it's sort of tongue-in-cheek, but that big Sun Valley conference where all the moguls go. I say it would be a much livelier meeting if Sidney and Manuela were parading around there in their designer outfits, which I'm very proud of the photo section in there because
exactly.
Sometimes pictures say, 10,000 words. I didn't really have to describe much about Sidney and Manuela, those pictures.
Yeah, they do.
And
you also got their receipts from Hermes and Chanel and all sorts of things.
Yes. Anyway, so they were one threat, and then the Philippe Dumont and Les Moonves, who were used to running their own empires, see Sumner deteriorate, and they say, well, I'm going to step up here and get mine. So they both mounted campaigns to gain control of their respective empires. And one of the dramatic incidents is that Moonves, being advised by the very prominent law firm of Wachtell Lipton, cooked up this lawsuit to strip the Redstones of their voting control of the company. And actually, while he knew, well, in fact, as our book shows, while he's being essentially blackmailed by the manager of an actress he had assaulted many years before, he goes ahead and launches this lawsuit against Sherry Redstone, stabbing her in the back. Like, it really is right out of Shakespeare. Sherry thought they were best friends. And she gets a call early in the morning saying, "You've been sued in Delaware." And she says, "What?" And then it was all out war, with basically sharing the family interests against the boards, the CEOs, and the women.
And you talk about the way the boards treated Sherry.
Unbelievable. I mean, the leak we got from the confidential source provided us with a look at what really goes on in boardrooms. Now, you're on some boards, so you've actually sat in some of these meetings and probably have seen some things that you can't talk about, but if people knew, it would be an eye-opening experience. But we in the press who aren't on these boards rarely get access to this. But here we actually did. We got the documents, we got the comments, we got the minutes, and the reaction of the CBS board in particular, when the revelations about Moonves surfaced, they overwhelmingly said, "Oh, we don't care about that."
This is a Moonves, certainly on the Moonves, the allegations of sexual assault.
Yes.
I mean, several board members were like, "What's the big deal?"
Yeah, what's the big deal? Well, they did not say, for example, "Oh, these are just allegations. This hasn't been proven. We don't believe it." No, nobody was actually defending him like that. But they were saying things like, "Oh, well, who cares about that? We all did that." That was a direct line from a board meeting. Quote, "We all did that." And the former William Coleman, the former Secretary of Defense, was on there and stood up and said, I think it was the direct quote was something like, "I don't care if 100 more women come forward. He is our leader, and we're standing behind him." It's astonishing. And again, that this was actually said, and we were able to document that. To me, you can only imagine what else went on that we don't know about, but that they would say things like this. And this is like years after Harvey Weinstein was exposed. It wasn't like the Me Too movement was just hadn't happened. It was in full swing, and they're saying we don't care about any of that.
And so, how was it resolved?
Well, as the story, tells all of this, none of that affected the board. In fact, really, the revelations in the New Yorker article had very little effect on the board. If that had been all that had happened, he would still be there. But there were two things that did him in. And one was that he was being blackmailed, and he was succumbing to it. So the actress he had assaulted long ago when she was in her early 20s, and they would have probably ignored that. They wouldn't have cared. But the manager had gotten back in touch with him and said, "Oh, she's unhappy. She's getting calls from the New York Times." She had gotten some calls from, not me, but from a New York Times reporter. "Maybe she's going to talk." And Moonves disputed some of these other women and said it was all consensual, whatever. But he knew he had a problem. And so the manager, of course, is saying, "Well, she'd like a part. Maybe it's time for her to have a part," even though decades have gone by now. And so, instead of saying, "Look, I'm going to return you into the, authorities or something," he succumbed to it. And he starts maneuvering. You see him twisting and turning and trying to deal with this manager and keeping at arm's length. And then ultimately, they did offer this woman a part. But they, unfortunately, it's funny. It's not that funny. But so the actress, who didn't know any of this was going on, her manager just kept saying, "Oh, they're interested in you," and never kind of put the two and two together until later. But they came to her with this part, and the parts have brief descriptions. There's a name for it. I can't think of it right now. But the description said that the part that she was going to get was a, quote, "big, friendly woman." And big is code for fat or overweight. and that set her off. And she summarily rejected the part. And by the way, I don't think she is over. I mean, when you see the picture of her, you know, she's gorgeous. But anyway, that was when she was younger. So I honestly don't know what she looks like today, although I did interview her at length. But so she rejected it. So then that whole thing blew up. And then she found out about what the manager was up to, and she was enraged that he was trying to leverage the painful experience she had gone through, basically to advance his own career. This wasn't about getting her a part, but of course, if she got parts, then he'd be back in the game. And he was a has-been, and this was his ticket, and he's like talking to the head of CBS. So when the board lawyers found out that essentially he was doing something not 20 years ago and not a sexual assault, but that he was interfering to cover this up, that was a problem. And then there was this other woman who had gone to the police, and there was a police report that was filed, and that had been covered up. So again, really what did him in, as I've discovered in much of my reporting, was the cover-up. It was the hiding it, the lying to lawyers, and then finally the Sherry forces on the board were able to basically tell the other directors, you know, if you don't respond to this, you'll be in breach of fiduciary duty. And they did then vote him out. So that's how he went out. The Domas situation was a little bit different because basically Sherry, once the women were out of the picture, now that's a whole story. I can't go into all the details, but it's very cinematic. The blow up, you can imagine what happened when Sumner found out about George and how that all happened. That's a great story, but that all blew up. So the women got kicked out of the mansion. Sherry was then back with her father and advised him and finally persuaded him that Paramount was in a downward spiral. It was. He had tried to sell Paramount with you know, be out from under Sumner, and Sumner felt he'd been betrayed, and then he basically got the trustees to fire Doman. So Sherry, first she had to get rid of the women, then she had to get rid of Doman, then she had to get rid of Moonves, and finally she had some peace of mind. Although, did she?
Did she? Does she?
I think when you read the last scene of the book, you know the answer. I don't want to give that away. I have to hold back.
It is.
I have to hold back.
I mean, the amazing thing is, in spite of all that you have revealed, you are holding back so much. And so it says something about your assiduous journalism and your ability to just be this rare storyteller who brings the business analysis and metrics and benchmarks of corporate performance with the really scintillating, prurient information that we love to read. So we're going to have questions. We've got a few minutes for any questions. And remember, and please go to a microphone there. And remember, a question is a brief sentence that ends with a question mark. Yes, please.
This is quite fascinating and very dramatic. But my question is, in terms of the psychiatric assessments as a journalist, those should have been protected by HIPAA law. So did you have permission to access those? Because you're speaking about them, and I trained as a psychologist, but that's quite sensitive material. And I realize the court may have addressed these assessments, and I'm not certain if this was a sealed or unsealed case. So if the case was unsealed and the reports were noted in the press, then it wouldn't be as much of an issue. But
so what is the
question is, were these HIPAA protected, and if so, how did you obtain them, and weren't there moral, ethical, and legal constraints?
Right. Well, those are good questions, and believe me, I did give a good deal of thought about you know, whether to include all this information. But let me say before I address that, first of all, this very extensive report had been ordered by the court, and it was introduced as part of the court file, and it was initially filed under seal, and it was later unsealed. And but to my knowledge, I was the only reporter who ever kind of went back to the court file once these materials had been unsealed. So I was able to get access to it. I might not have used it, but Sumner Redstone had died by the time this came out. So it was not a question of violating his privacy.
Great. So we're going to have the next question, please. Oh, Michael is there. Next question.
I'm Michael Myers. I'm the president of the New York Civil Rights Coalition. My question is, what took Redstone so long to plan a transition? I mean, why did he wait so long? And my second question is, what were the lawyers doing? And what did they know? And when did they know it?
So Michael, the lawyer, wants to know, why did it take him so long? And what were the lawyers doing?
Well, you'll see in the story that Sumner was going around to anyone who would listen to say, I'm never going to die.
There's a chapter that starts.
Yes. And of course he can't have been entirely serious about that, but he believed that the minute anyone got a whiff that he might be stepping aside or anointing a successor, he would lose his power. And by the time he should have really been addressing that, his mental state, I think, was sort of deteriorating. But he proved incapable of that. Now, incredibly interesting to me was a revelation he made to one of his many mistresses, that one reason he said that is, he said, I've led a terrible life, and the last judgment for me when I die is going to be harsh. I know that. And so I'm not gonna die, because the reckoning is going to be severe.
That's a perspective on life.
But when you think about it, ask yourself, he did get the reckoning. He didn't have to die to get the reckoning. I mean, I think we all have to think about that a little bit sometimes. You think you have to die before somebody's going to hold you account for your bad behavior? I don't think so. And these women, he had his own hell going on in there. He's crying. He wants to get out of the house, so they've got him trapped in there. It's not a life that I want to live. So I think he got his reckoning. The lawyers, that's a whole, look, they're great lawyers. They're not so great lawyers. But a lot of lawyers, the financial rewards can so distort their judgment, in my view. And here, we're talking about millions and millions and millions of legal fees, not to mention, power and influence, being trustees and controlling these fortunes, and then having him donate, millions of dollars to their charities. It's all very incestuous and intertwined. And time again, I kept thinking, no, this is not in Sumner Redstone's best interest. And yet the lawyers would do it, because I think it was in their interest.
Yes, sir.
Jim, I'm Philip Ellison. I think you and I may have met years ago when I was working representing Nokia internationally. But my question really is, if you can draw some parallels with other family dynasties in the media sphere, the Oaks-Sulzbergers, the people who used to actually run the Wall Street Journal. Now I guess it's owned by someone else.
Bancrofts.
Bancrofts. But to talk about that power of a family having that influence in an area so sensitive for the future of democracy.
Great
and that
question.
Is, we have so limited sources now, controlled by such a concentration of power.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm not going to say anything about the Sulzbergers because I work for the New York Times. I think I'm just going to leave that one off limits. But I did get to know the Bancrofts very well when I was at the Wall Street Journal, and it's a very interesting phenomenon in this country that the great media empires, the old Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune, needless to say, the whole Fox empire, the New York Post. There are these family enterprises, and as you see in this book, the minute you're combining the business element of it with a family, you're layering on a whole complex set of psychological issues, really. And family, what's the famous line from Tolstoy that all families are unhappy, but yeah, right, exactly. But anyway, that's plays out here, and they're to varying degrees. I think it's fair to say these families eventually they can't hold it all together. Their conflicts develop. Obviously the Murdochs there's a huge split in the Murdoch family. And what's going to happen when Rupert, as I don't think he's going around saying he's going to live forever, but he's acting kind of like he's going to live forever. And I don't think that there's no succession plan there. I think that's really has been worked out. So in many cases, they end up selling, and so the number of these family-owned enterprises is dwindling. At their best, they protected these media companies from purely profit-driven motives. And they upheld, a sort of shared sense of journalistic standards. And what we're now seeing with the rise of social media, new forms of, media competition is a profit-driven, race to the bottom, I have to say.
Well, and it's one of the things, and you won't say it about the Sulzbergers, but I will, because they're the only ones left standing. I mean, the Grahams sold
They
the
sold,
Washington
right.
Post. I mean, the Bancrofts, everyone thought, but then there's the Chandlers, of course,
the
with
Chandlers
the
are
Times,
out.
and the Bancrofts, everyone thought the family could hold it together, but then there were a couple of cousins
Yes.
who said we started talking offline, and next thing you know, Rupert Murdoch is swooping in. And so, to the Sulzbergers' credit, they have a seemingly ironclad, intergenerational, shared belief in stewarding this important asset for democracy. And that is just, they're the last one standing. And it's, I mean, the excellence of the New York Times is in part a tribute to their commitment to because they could be a lot richer.
Oh, yeah.
They could be a lot richer if it was just about money. So we have 2 more questions. Yes?
I don't know that I answered your question exactly, but it maybe just. It's too big to answer. Yes.
Please.
Okay. Hi. Thanks. I'd like to pick up on the excellence of the New York Times. What was your feeling coming away from this of how the business press has covered this story and others? On the one hand, we have the press with Harvey Weinstein and also with Moonves did all this reporting. On the other, they often build people up, right? Harvey Weinstein for years got away with Bob Iger seems to have been somebody who was also built up. Now we see maybe he has feet of clay. I don't know. Would you reflect on how the business press did in this affair and on others?
Good question.
Yeah. Look, the business press it's no different from the rest of the press. I mean, it's looking for stories, and it's on the outside, trying to penetrate, trying to look in. And to actually gain access to what's really going on at the centers of great wealth and power is extremely difficult. These people, as you well know, Darren, have vested interests in not having the world know about this. And one thing that troubles me over my career as a journalist, as the remuneration of reporters has gone down, 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 is that many of the talented people who would have been maintaining careers in journalism are now working in PR. They're working for the big PR firms, or they're working in corporate communications, and they have these massive staffs. And somebody goes in and tries to do a story, and they get, they flood the zone. They overwhelm people. They threaten lawsuits. In some cases, they bring lawsuits, and that's happening. Like the whole Gawker thing. I'm not here to defend Gawker, but it got shut down by a powerful, rich person bringing a lawsuit against them. So that definitely worries me. I guess it's not so much that they, I think, build up people and then knock them down. They're always looking for interesting stories, and success can be an interesting story. I take Bob Iger, for example. He was riding high and seemed to have the magic touch. It's worth writing about. But how many people were really, how much access did I or others get to those board meetings where he's discussing, should we go into streaming or not? None. And the confidentiality. And another thing that I've noticed in my career is people leave a company and they immediately get a big severance payment, and the big item in their departure agreement is you cannot talk. You cannot tell anybody anything. And I cannot tell you how many of these things I run into routinely now. And fortunately for us, there are people who not even in their own self-economic interest. They care more about getting the truth out than they do. And then this woman who came forward, she got ruined. She got disbarred. She paid a huge price for sharing with us all that information. And her sole motive was she knew that it was all going to get swept under the rug with this kind of like fake investigation that was going on. And then they'd never get to the bottom of it.
And she then is harmed herself economically.
Hugely.
And in
economically,
other ways, reputationally.
psychologically, reputationally. I mean, maybe there are lawyers in the audience, but lawyers are even now will come up to me and say that what she did was reprehensible. She violated the attorney-client privilege. And I find myself occasionally reminding people, you know, there are exceptions to the attorney-client privilege. It's not ironclad. If your client is committing a crime, you have an obligation to disclose it. Now, that wasn't quite the situation, but she felt a moral imperative to disclose this at her own peril. But there aren't many people like that.
Yes. Last question, please.
Oh, your book sounds very interesting. I was just wondering if you could shed light on, or if it's in the book itself, on the relationship, controversy, and feud with Tom Cruise and Sumner.
There is a little bit in there. You're talking about the famous scene where Tom Cruise went on some talk show. Was it Oprah? And started like flopping around on the sofa, like, you know,
Oprah.
declaring his undying love for, who is the celebrity?
Katie
Yeah,
Holmes.
I should know all this. I'm terrible about celebrities. Of course, they're divorced now. That's long over, despite his undying love. But it was Sumner's second wife got very upset about that and said he's got to go. And she sort of influenced him, and that later led to part of the rupture between Sumner getting rid of his second wife and then bringing Tom Cruise back. He had banished him from the lot, and then they brought him back. And so, you know, by the time the women are hosting Sumner's 90th birthday party, which, you know, Tom Cruise was there, believe me. And of course now, you know, he did what, Maverick, Top Gun last year, and Mission Impossible now. He's propping up the whole Paramount studio. I'd say he was a good investment on Sumner's part.
Well, please join me in thanking
Thank you.
James
Thanks
B.
for coming.
Stewart.
Thank you, Darren. This is so much fun.
And we have copies of the book for you to take home.